read an argument for God and think, right, that's all that's settled, God definitely exists. And I read an argument against God and think, oh, never mind. Blimey, this question of God's existence really is complicated. I quite like for there to be a God. The idea really appeals to me. Jesus in the Gospels really appeals to me.
Are you saying you're one of these non-resistant skeptics?
I like to think so.
I've got a friend who has put it this way. He said, look, Justin, basically I'm an atheist, but when I listen to Bach, I am a Christian.
The choral piece that would be the closest to that for me would be Gustav Holst's Nunc Dimittis. When I kind of listen to a really beautiful piece of music, and I am getting really wooey here, so I do apologise. Almost Christian way to describe it would be I feel myself rest. That is the time in which the human will stops raging itself and just kind of rest. Definitely relates to that when I experience a sense of beauty. I don't think that it's persuasive evidence.
What would constitute the kind of evidence you're looking for?
Bona fide religious experience would convince me. If I were there it's literally watching the ascension of Christ. It strikes me that almost any rational person would have to concede at that point that God exists. I think that the way that the kind of zeitgeist is more towards this kind of God as meaning or God as value. I think that theism is a lot more substantial than that. A claim is that Christ rose from the dead and will come again in glory to judge the quick and the dead. That seems like it would change every aspect of your, like overnight. If I believed that, my life would totally transform.
Joe Folley, hello.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Oh, it's great. I just wanted to sit down with you, just have a conversation really about what you do, your beliefs, and not to try and persuade you in a different direction, but just to kind of get a sense of what might get you further towards Christian faith if you were to ever head in that direction. So tell us about Joe, the atheist today. Has he always been an atheist? Would you say there's been any variation in the way you look at the world and God and that kind of thing over your life?
So I have been an atheist since I was about a teenager. So I was raised in a kind of fairly bog standard C of E household. Parents weren't particularly devout, but weren't sort of...
Went along at Christmas, did that
Oh no,
kind
went
of
to church every week.
Oh, you did? Okay,
but
fine.
Sort of, it wasn't a kind of staple of the household, so to speak. And I just sort of, I kind of began to question this, and I think I eventually kind of had a lot of jumping back and forth between faith and not faith. I kind of read an argument for God and think, right, that's all that's settled, God definitely exists. And I read an argument against God and think, oh, never mind. Blimey, this question of God's existence really is complicated. And sort of, so I kind of did that for a number of years, and then I was kind of a sort of a new atheist for a little bit.
Right.
And
what does that mean when you say, I was in between things for a while and then I was just very convinced that God didn't exist, or more than that?
Yeah, so I for a while I had a lot of confidence in my belief that God doesn't exist.
Had you been influenced by the new atheist writings?
Yes, yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that, I still think that those writings have a lot of value to them. I think that, especially if you're dealing with, very fundamentalist versions of faith, I think a lot of them have a lot of very good arguments against that. And then, I kind of got to university and then also a bit after university, kind of exploring some of the more sophisticated arguments for God. And also, one of my friends at university was very into Christian mysticism. So I kind of picked up Junior of Norwich and a bit of Meister Eckhart and some more Christian mystic writings. And I don't know, just helped me see faith from a different angle. And then, reading some sort of Thomist texts and maybe some more sophisticated versions of things like the fine-tuning arguments, thought, okay, I'm not convinced that God exists, but at the very least, I'm not confident that he doesn't exist either. I also just sort of became a bit more, a bit less dismissive of scripture and religious thinking as a whole. I kind of picked up, especially these Christian mystics, sort of encouraged me to pick up scripture with a bit of a mind of, okay, yeah, like I don't think that Jesus rose from the dead, but let's read this as under the frame of, okay, this is a deeply influential text and has probably shaped the general arc of the thinking in my home country more than almost any other book. So let's just see what we can get out of it without necessarily metaphysicalizing too much. And so, that kind of, I read a lot of the kind of wisdom literature and a fair amount of that kind of side of the Old Testament, and then the Gospels, and sort of just kind of sorts to try and see what I could get from them from an atheist perspective. And I think you can get quite a lot.
I mean, obviously, a lot of these experiences, going to university, having the opportunity to read some of the great Christian minds of the past and engage, I suppose, with Christian thinkers as well as non-Christian thinkers, and see that, oh, it turns out there's quite a variety here and some interesting arguments after all. You did mention that actually being, I think, a chorister was also somewhat influential. Now, was that because of the beauty of what you were doing in that space, or something else?
I was a choral scholar at my college, and that was a lot of fun. I just joined it because I thought it'd be good fun. Then I did it for a number of years while I was there, and yeah, as a result, I ended up talking to lots of religious people, but also lots of visiting preachers and the priest at my college, or the chaplain, I should say, and so we would talk a lot about God. And again, I just kind of got introduced to slightly more sophisticated versions of arguments that I sort of dismissed out of hand, and I still ended up with problems with them. But again, you can kind of have scales of confidence, right? So, you're presented with a very caricatured argument for God, and it leaves you with the impression that, okay, there's basically no reason to believe in God. And then you might get presented with a more sophisticated one. You still might end up having good reasons to reject it. But that doesn't necessarily lead to the same level of confidence in disbelief. You end up with being slightly more in the agnostic camp about things.
Of course. I mean, just sticking with the actual thing of you singing in presumably quite a lovely chapel or something, and beautiful poetic and musical pieces for choral evensong and so on. I've got a friend who has put it this way. He said, look, Justin, basically I'm an atheist, or I'm very skeptical of organised religion in general. He says, but when I listen to Bach, I am a Christian. He says it's like something happens to me when I engage beauty in that way, and it speaks to me in a way that an evidential argument for God leaves me cold, kind of thing. I don't know if that makes any sense to you. Have you ever had that kind of?
Yes, I think that probably the choral piece that would be the closest to that for me would be Gustav Holst's Nunc Dimittis, which is a kind of 8-part Nunc Dimittis, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And yeah, so I kind of resonate with that experience of beauty. I think that I think that there's a sort of balance to be struck here, right? If you want to, because as somebody who's sort of an atheist, almost quite reluctantly, I quite like for there to be a God. The idea really appeals to me. I think that Jesus in the Gospels really appeals to me. So I'm kind of there's a kind of baseline emotional openness I have to faith.
Are you saying you're one of these non-resistant skeptics?
I like to think so. Who can tell? I think that the as far as I can tell, the whole debate about divine hiddenness since Schellenberg's book has just been people going, I'm a non-resistant non-believer, and
now
then a bunch of people
God.
saying, no,
you're
not.
I'm all ears.
Yes, exactly.
God, just show up and I'm all yours.
But I think that I do make an active effort to try and maintain intellectual openness there, partly because just to counteract the general human bias that we all have when we believe in something, to simply reject out of hand anything that might challenge that. I think.
What is going on though, I suppose, when you listen to that Nunc Dimittis though, or sing it, and I mean, I guess at one level, do you kind of go to, yes, there is a naturalistic story here of what's happening, and it involves neurons and firings and this producing a certain set of serotonin or whatever that makes me feel a certain way. Because obviously there's going to be people who say that's a description of what's happening, but it's not an exhaustive description of what's happening. Yes,
I mean, I think that there's obviously an experiential element, right? I think that when I account for it, at least in linear causality through this sort of biological story, I think that when I try and pin down the feeling, I think that I think I pin it down in a relatively similar way that someone like Schopenhauer or Philip Mainlander does, where they say, actually, I can kind of feel my desires pause for a little bit. And that's how I would describe the feeling of being immersed in something beautiful.
Feel your desires pause.
So, that there's this, when I kind of look at something or kind of listen to a really beautiful piece of music, and I am getting really wooey here, so I do apologize. the closest thing I could use to describe this, and again, I'm hardly the only person to describe it this way, would be something like, I kind of feel myself calm, and I feel my, very, almost Christian way to describe it would be I feel myself rest. And I think that's one of the reasons why why a lot of Christians, when they experience beauty, that can be quite a theologically powerful experience, because to a certain extent, we just had a conversation with Jonathan Pageau, and we talked about St. Maximus the Confessor, and one of his kind of idea of salvation is incredibly tied up with the notion of rest. This idea that we're striving towards an ideal, that we desire it and we fall short of it, and then salvation is finding it, and then that is the time in which the human will stops raging itself and it just kind of rests. And I think to a certain extent, and I can definitely relate to that when I experience a sense of beauty. Yeah. I don't think that it's persuasive evidence. But then again, I do sometimes wonder about this sort of thing, right? Because on the one hand, I would say, okay, yeah, I have a causal story, so it's not quite evidence. But I also want to remain open to the idea that a bona fide religious experience, I suppose it's kind of a pun actually, a bona fide religious experience would convince me.
Yeah.
Because I think about, again, referring back to our conversation, if I were there it's literally watching the ascension of Christ, I think that any rational, or maybe I shouldn't say, maybe that's too strong a word, but it strikes me that almost any rational person would have to concede at that point that God exists. And I think that it's important for any belief that one holds, really, is to outline the circumstances in which that belief would be undermined. Because otherwise, otherwise it almost seems either it's true by definition, or it's kind of methodologically outlawed.
It's interesting because it kind of brings us to that whole question of what would constitute the kind of evidence you're looking for. I'm going to use an extreme here, and this does not represent you or most atheists, but I once moderated a conversation that included Peter Atkins, the Oxford chemist, who is on the more sort of pugnacious end of the new atheist spectrum. Sort of any conversation I've had him on, he just dismisses Christian belief as poppycock and fairy tales and lazy thinking. And we got to the point in this conversation I had him on with a Christian thinker where we were saying to him, well, look, what kind of evidence would convince you? So if the stars lined up and said, Peter, I'm here, it's me. And he said, well, alien technology could do something like that. I was like, okay, well, what if Jesus appeared to you in the room right now and said, it's me, believe in me now, Peter? He said, I'd assume I was having some kind of brain malfunction. And at that point we said, well, it sounds like there's no evidence that because you're going to run it through this naturalistic assumptions you have that there is always going to be a naturalistic explanation for it. And I'm not saying this is true of most atheists, but I think there are some who, in a sense, are so wedded to a naturalist, materialist sort of worldview that in a sense, you could never provide any evidence that would sort of overcome the level of skepticism that they've applied. But it sounds like you're not there. You're saying I'm open, and if something like I saw the ascension, that would probably give me enough reason to believe that there is a God.
Yes, and I'd set the bar quite a bit lower than that. I feel like that's a tall order, so transport me back to 33 AD. But no, I think that having a religious experience seems to me to be very good evidence. It's just non-transferable evidence, And I think I think that one of the reasons why I think that looking into miracles or purported miracles like the miracle of the sun is really cool for me. Is because partly because I go in there thinking, oh, this could be it, because but then you go, I don't know, looked into it more and I think, oh, actually people's reports are really different and stuff, and they'd all been staring at the sun all day, so actually they probably would see something a bit weird. And I think, oh, that's a real shame, because say you and I both looked over there and Christ appeared and talked to us, then I wouldn't have been able to dismiss it as a hallucination. We've both seen it. Right. Then it's like, yeah, sure, you could come up with a naturalistic explanation, but it seems like at the very least that's going to move your prior significantly the next time you encounter anything that could be evidence for religious belief. It's going to shift. It's going to at least shift your confidence in
I mean,
your opinions about.
I suppose the great danger is, though, that if we're sort of basically saying, look, this bit of evidence would be enough to shift my priors and I'd kind of go in the direction of that. It could be the next day something comes along and suddenly, oh, pours cold water on that, and it turns out there was some other explanation, and I'm going to have to shift back here. And I suppose in the end, there's a kind of sense in which I think a lot of Christians sort of say, look, I've got enough evidence of that nature to kind of make me feel like I'm not committing a sort of intellectual suicide by believing in God and trusting that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. But I'm never going to have a sort of some probabilistic, overwhelming sort of sense. And I'm just got to, and faith kind of is just committing myself to say, look, I'm in now. I'm going to go with this, and I'm going to trust my life to this. And in a sense, the experience of knowing God is in a sense one that you step into. It's a kind of like you have to step into that stream and start to live as though God exists and do the things, and then maybe things start. What the way one person put it to me is like this. He said, you know, there's a great value very often to the person who's outside the faith, kind of looking from the outside and prodding and poking. It's a bit like someone coming up to a church and seeing the windows from the outside, and they're opaque, but when you go inside and see the sunlight streaming through those stained glass windows, you get a very different experience. It's the sort of I believe in order to understand kind of thing. And you sort of have to step inside sometimes the Christian story to really understand it. And for me, I suppose that's always the missing piece of any skeptic who's kind of trying to build up enough evidence to be able to do that. It's like, well, you're never going to get the full picture until you've sort of taken that step of faith and said, let's see if this works, basically.
Hi there, I hope you're enjoying the show. If you'd like a free chapter from my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and also from my latest book, Why I'm Still a Christian, then subscribe to my newsletter and I'll send you those chapters along with updates on my work. I won't spam you, just encourage you with Thinking Faith articles, events, videos and resources. The newsletter link is with the info. Enjoy the rest of the show.
Yeah, I can certainly imagine that you know, the experience of Christianity is very different from being a Christian to what I'm doing, which is essentially studying it from the outside. I think that there's a kind of tension here in the sense that the kind of norms governing belief formation that I apply to sort of everything basically dictate that I must, you know, that if I'm going to be consistent, I must demand of even things. And the reason I talk about this God is partly because I find the idea quite appealing, and so I'm sort of not duty bound in a kind of thick moral sense, but if I'm going to assign it the same level of confidence I would any of my other beliefs, then I would have to hold it up to the same kind of evidential or rational standards. So that's why I think that the idea of a felt or a kind of veridical seeming religious experience would be so handy. It's because then you could kind of point to it. You could say, actually, no, because I do. My only worry about stuff like, okay, yeah, because I do get this occasion of somebody like, okay, try living as a Christian and see what happens. And I do sort of think, okay, yeah, that's fine. Apart from the fact that I think then any kind of faith that I have would be basically built on sand. You know, it'd be kind of all it would take would be for a kind of slight challenge.
Okay.
And it would crumble. You know, the kind of idea of like, Plato talks about, you know, his kind of justified true belief model of knowledge. And the justification is important because it anchors the belief to the truth.
Yeah.
And that's kind of partly what I'm looking for, because I do think there's an experiential, or at least from reading mystics, there seems to be a kind of experiential element to religion that I don't want to in any way discount. At the same time, I think that the reason why having your beliefs not just built on I'm not saying that your beliefs are just built on desire, but having that, for me, that would have to play such a large role that I, to a certain extent, think the belief would just inevitably end up very unstable.
Right.
So,
and is that just about the way you're wired? I don't know, because I know other people for whom they just do not need, I suppose, this foundation of very strong evidential kind of probability. They just sort of, they just say, I've got a friend who just says, I just kind of know God's there. It's just apparent to him that God exists and that he should live his life as a Christian. And he's not really that fussed about coming up with XYZ arguments to buttress that. He just says, it just works for me, and is that just he's wired differently to Joe Folley?
It might be. I mean, if I wanted to give an explanation inside a Christian framework, I'd say something like, that's a gift of grace. Yes. And if God exists, it probably is. I think that.
Why hasn't God given you that gift of grace then?
I don't know. That's what I try and think about. Sort of being an agnostic. Trying to think about, wanting to, on the one hand, keep myself open, and on the other hand, consistently apply my kind of regulative norms that I try to apply to all my other beliefs, at least.
So, what's interesting to me, though, is that you say, I'd really actually quite like God to exist. I'm quite attracted to God. I'm quite attracted to aspects of Christianity. Now, that's not true of all atheists, obviously. So you go to Christopher Hitchens, he's like, accusing God of being, North Korean dictator. Thomas Nagel famously said, it concerns me that intelligent people believe in God. I don't want the universe to be like that, And he says, he's just quite honest about his sort of personal bias against God. But you seem to be on the flip side, yes, an atheist, agnostic, like they are or were, but like actually, what is it that you find attractive about God? What would that do? How would that be helpful, or in some way, I don't know, be good as far as you can see?
I think, again, part of it is just an emotional appeal. I think that there's, I have a natural craving for everything to make sense and have a purpose, and that would be really nice.
And is that the only way you could see that happening if God exists?
Oh no, I think that something that I've been trying to do recently on the channel is sort of potentially explore, just in theory, just to kind of broaden people's kind of metaphysical imagination, other ideas of metaphysics or ontology that aren't theistic but aren't also materialist atheist. This kind of
Platonism or
Platonism. Platonism's such a good example just because people kind of already know it. But anything like Thomas Nagel's got his kind of natural teleology or whatever he's calling it now, and
some kind of guiding, for want of a better word, logos or sort of purpose in the universe. But he still calls himself an atheist.
Yes, and even if even if you don't want to go down any of those routes, you can kind of complicate the observer-observed distinction by, maybe looking at Kant and thinking about, okay, well, maybe there are certain things that are preconditions for my experience that can't rightly be assigned to the world in itself. It's kind of, it is, there's an idealist element, but it's not Bishop Berkeley style idealism. It's transcendental idealism. There are partly that's why I'm fascinated by that argumentative style.
Why don't those things seem to have the purchase that the idea of a personal God has?
I think the personal aspect is a big part of the emotional appeal of God. I also think that, reading the Gospels, even if you're not a believer, Jesus comes across as a pretty nice guy. It's not to put it too crudely or to reduce it to that, but there's clearly something emotionally appealing about the way that Jesus goes about interacting with people, and just the idea of kind of love and forgiveness as a norm. I say this. I also think that I don't want to go too far as to denying the more problematic elements of Scripture, like the slaughter of the Amalekites and stuff like that. But at the same time, in some ways, that's the luxury of reading Scripture as an atheist, is you get to pick and choose. It becomes you end up using it as a text of philosophy, or as a kind of as a point of examining it almost like literature.
Yes, and I think you can do that in a sense as a Christian. It's just obviously there's this extra dimension where you believe that actually this is a text about someone, or that's it all culminating in someone at least, who claimed to be God, and if you are a Christian, you believe he really was the incarnation of that logos, and everything sort of comes down to him, and leaves still with lots of questions often about Scripture and how you make sense of the Amalekites and all of that. But I guess it does, it it can be treated as an interesting historical piece of literature and everything, but it's also got this other aspect to it, which is talking about something that is foundational to life and everything. And I'm kind of like, for me, I don't know, do you feel like what you need to kind of cross that divide, if you like, is just a really good argument? Like, hey, give me that really great historical argument for the resurrection, Justin, and I might be on board. Or would all of that have, that's all useful, but really it's that religious thing I need, that religious experience that's the only thing that's going to really take me there.
I mean, I think either would probably do it. I mean, I think that, on the one hand, I think that if you're presented with an incontrovertible argument for the truth of something, if you want to be minimally consistent in your epistemic norms, you're going to have to accept it. So I think on one hand, that would be very nice. And on the other hand, I think that a religious experience is the kind of thing that, although it's non-transferable, like the nice thing about a reasoned argument is that anyone can understand it. And once they do understand it, it's exactly the same evidential import for them as it is for anyone else, especially if it's one of these more sort of deductive arguments. The thing about a religious experience is it's very persuasive, but it's also private. It's non-transferable. Yeah. And so, to be honest, either of them would do, because they both end up fulfilling roughly the same role, which is that they're evidence, as in they are.
I'm going to ask quite a personal question now, which is, have you ever actually asked for a religious experience?
Yes, I have. Okay. I actually went through a phase of asking every night.
Okay.
As I went to sleep.
And what were you effectively asking for? Was it something specific, or just whatever it'll take?
I sort of just asked for a religious experience in the abstract, in the sense that I figure that if there was somebody hearing it, they're probably in a better position than me to know how that ought to manifest.
Did anything happen?
No, I'm sad to say it didn't. And I was really quite hopeful. Right. But I hopefully.
Right. Well, it hasn't closed the door to something happening. No, but it's not like that's your experiment done and you've moved on or anything.
No, I think that again, this might just be emotional bias. I can't claim that I have a perfect argument for keeping the door open, other than that I think that there will be a certain amount of emotional fulfillment in it, in being true.
It's really interesting because it's reminded me of something I did on my Unbelievable show some time back. I don't know if you've come across the Oxford philosopher Tim Mawson, but he's a sort of theistic philosopher, and he wrote this interesting paper called Why Atheists Should Pray to God. And it was basically a sort of Pascalian type argument of, look, it won't do any harm doing it. And it's a kind of, just at a kind of empirical testing things level, you should ask for God to reveal himself to you if he exists. That should be something that's a sort of scientific kind of thing to do. So I kind of, we did something fun. We constructed what we call the atheist prayer experiment. And we got a whole bunch of atheists to start praying on a regular basis for 40 days. We felt that was an appropriately biblical number. For 40 days, for God to reveal himself to them. And I think we ended up with about 70 people who took part in this. And we sort of, tracked it. It wasn't, a double blind test or anything, but it was a bit of a fun kind of social experiment. And a number of people kind of didn't take it seriously, kind of dropped out, didn't really, were there just for fun. But a good number did kind of see it through and kind of reported on their experiences. And the majority, like you said, nothing happened. Okay. And then some said, things happened. I noticed things more. But some of them were like saying, I think that was just down to the fact I was taking a moment each day to be in a more kind of meditative space. And I was just more open to seeing connections between things or whatever. Some people said a lot of coincidences seemed to happen during that time, but maybe I was just more open to seeing them in some way. One person said, I actually heard an audible voice. And they said it was a very helpful voice. But in the end, it didn't convince them that God exists. They just felt that was kind of something coming from within them in a response. 2 people became Christians, interestingly. But the funny thing about it is that both of them fell outside, strictly speaking, the window of this experiment. These were two women, and one was quite heavily pregnant at the time, and started kind of praying before we had sort of officially launched the thing. Then gave birth, and after that said, I just believed in God. Like all of those things together, The other one was someone who started praying again, sort of before the thing had officially launched, and said, as soon as I started praying, the light kind of just came on. It was apparent to me that God is there. And so the irony was that we couldn't really include those in the results because they had not officially fallen within the. So if there is a God, it was kind of, I felt like God's sense of humour, that the two positive results were kind of not officially countable in this little experiment we've done. And of course, I obviously don't believe in, as a Christian, even as a Christian, that you can put God in a test tube and in that sort of way.
So you can't really do a double blind. If
No, when you've got a free agent like God, you sort of messes up all your kind of clinical, attempts at measuring prayer, which is why I think other people who have tried to do sort of prayer tests and things, it's a bit of a misguided venture because you're dealing with a God who may or may not choose to be involved in your experiment.
I think that one of the reasons why I think that I do think experiments like that have a utility. I think they're just better suited to testing the idea of an impersonal force. So, like, for example, I think you can empirically disprove certain things, like manifestations are a really good example. This idea like, if you focus on something and you want it in the right way, it just will happen. Like you can run experiments on that because it's a law. It's there's
a sort of principle that in theory should hold.
Yes, exactly.
I
think you come up with a different problem testing prayer is that you've got something or someone that can choose to do or not do something. And probably it might go.
I mean, what you probably can test is, on average, the people who pray or do religious activities in general, they tend to, on average, have these better outcomes or something. And I think the research has been done about that, but it doesn't obviously say, therefore, God exists. It just says that we could at least measure certain effects of what happens to people when they pray or meditate.
And I think testing stuff like this is always quite difficult on the basis that a religious community isn't just a religion, it's a community. And community is associated with all sorts of factors. But, I think that I'm totally open to the idea that it might lead to better outcomes. I mean, I think that, on the point about community, veering away from religion a tiny bit, I think that if there's anything that we need at the moment, it's a little bit of community. I think that the something that, this, you talk about the kind of surprising rebirth in God, and I think that perhaps one of the reasons, kind of perhaps not straightforwardly religious reasons, is that I think people are crying out for some kind of community. I think that we live in the kind of history of the world, we live an extraordinarily atomized existence. And whether or not you're religious, I think that's really worth noting, is that, we've kind of, in the past few centuries, we've gone from our world being a village to our world being simultaneously the entire world and also just our flat. It's kind of, now, in theory, you can go everywhere if you have the means, but also at the same time, a lot of when I think about where I want to settle down, I don't really think, I'd love to go to this abstract place. I think, no, I want to be embedded in like a nice community. That's kind of, I think also that's, while we're sort of touching on the subject, and it's also one of the reasons why people get very nostalgic about things like university or even like the latter part of school, is I think that a lot of the times it's not necessarily that particular institution. It's just the fact, oh God, that was the last time I was immersed in a community framework. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of that is driving some of this rebirth in religion.
The surprising rebirth of belief in God has been making waves since its launch. Many have predicted the death of God, not least the new atheists who proclaimed that science and reason would eradicate religion. And if you look at the statistics on church-going and belief in the modern West, you might be tempted to believe them. But there's an alternative story to be told about the surprising rebirth of belief in God. What if the tide of faith is beginning to come in again? I'm Justin Brierley, and I've been hosting conversations on faith between skeptics, seekers and believers all my adult life. Now, on the award-winning The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, discover the story of why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. Featuring interviews with leading thinkers across the faith spectrum, you'll learn the inside account of the rise and fall of New Atheism, why secular intellectuals like Jordan Peterson, Louise Perry and Tom Holland are talking about faith again, how developments in science, history, psychology and consciousness are pointing many back towards a divine mind, and why our modern day meaning crisis is priming a generation to investigate whether the biblical vision of life in all its fullness could be true after all. Plus, you'll see and hear live events debating the surprising rebirth, and hear from many adult converts who, after searching for a story to live by, were surprised to find the Christian story made sense of their lives. All 30 episodes of Season 1 of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God are available now. Listeners like Mark say this has to be the most thought-provoking podcast on the internet. Find out why we've become a #1 ranked religion and spirituality podcast when you jump in at episode 1. Go to justinbrierley.com/surprisingrebirth to subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. That's justinbrierley.com.
And I find that when I've interviewed ex-Christians, one of the things they most often cite as the thing they miss is the community. It's that part, and that's completely understandable. And I think in a funny way, one of the reasons why New Atheism at its peak was most attractive was when it looked most religious, in the sense that it gave people a common purpose. We were able to get together and have these conferences, and we sort of, it was a sort of quite a religious sort of thing. I think the problem was that in the end, New Atheism failed to kind of deliver on its promises for the culture generally, because it didn't provide a story that made sense for most people. Science and reason are great, but they don't generate the kind of community that religion does, essentially, or that quasi-religious kind of.
Well, yeah, I think that atheism just is a negative premise. It's very hard to, I wouldn't suggest building a community off of atheism, because it's.
Well, some people, when people tried to, they inevitably had very different conceptions of what that would be. Like, well, we should be atheism plus, which means we're actually committed to all these extra values. And Richard Dawkins went off in a kind of very anti that direction of, no, we're just about science, reason and common sense. And it's like, as soon as you move beyond just the denial of God bit of atheism, you immediately realize people have very different conceptions of what a community should be, what it should center around, what the positive values are that are going to bind you.
Yes, I think that I think that to a certain extent, any atheist or collection of atheists, if they want to form a community, they can't do it around atheism. It's going to be a pretty unstable foundation, and that and that's not necessarily anything inherent in atheism. It's just inherent in any kind of knot. It's very difficult to build anything out of a negative. I mean, you might temporarily do it. I mean, I think that if you have an active opponent, but I wouldn't suggest that you really want to build a community that you're going to enjoy off of an enemy. I think that sounds like it's not going to be a lot of fun.
So in the sense that atheism can't provide that, and given that, as we've said, some of these other interesting ideas that might try to give people a sense of transcendent meaning and that don't seem to have a lot of purchase in our culture either. Where do you see people kind of finding that meaning and that purpose and that community?
Well, I suppose, I think that existential philosophy is sort of a nice place to explore these questions. I think that I think that I don't think you can find meaning in just anything, on the basis that we are biological beings and we have a certain kind of psychological makeup. And while there are idiosyncrasies in psychological makeup between people, it's not like a human. Even a human psyche can just be constructed anyway. Like I for instance, can't, if you're in the same way that if you're not colorblind, you can't opt out of seeing color. It happens automatically. It's forced upon you. I think that the kinds of things that we can find meaning in, you can observe the kind of things that people find meaning in. People find meaning in beauty, and they find meaning in one another. They find meaning in sort of connections to one another. And none of those things atheist, in the sense that they're neither atheist nor not atheist. They have nothing to do with questions of God or lack thereof. I think that the trouble. I think that I think that the trouble is, to a certain extent, that atheism opens a lot of questions to do with meaning, and of course, atheism by itself can't answer it, and that's not the fault of atheism. It's because atheism is merely the denial of God, and so then you have a task on your hands. What are you going to do from here? And I think that of course, they're not going to be as comprehensive as traditions that have had thousands of years to develop answers to these questions. I actually think something that one of the reasons why I think Scripture is quite helpful to read as an atheist is partly because it is, in some sense, engaging with the same. From an atheist perspective, Scripture is the attempt by humans to engage with questions of meaning and value and purpose and community, and as a result, something like the Bible read through that lens is a fantastic resource for atheists to draw from, as are any other religious text. I'm just using that as an example. Another one I'm fond of is the kind of Tripitaka. So it's baskets of the Tripitaka means 3 baskets, and they're 3 collections of Buddhist suttas or sutras. Do you want some water?
No, I'm fine.
And again, very, very good material for learning from if you want to, because, as I say, I think that it's atheism is a negative doctrine. It actually eliminates a pretty substantial part of a lot of believers' worldviews. If you go from being a believer to being an atheist, that's a pretty substantial change. It would be very strange if that didn't cascade outwards in some way.
If you did become a believer, do you anticipate you would become a Christian? And if you did, would it be because that's sort of just where you've obviously your cultural surrounding and everything else, or do you genuinely feel like, hey, I could go become a Muslim, I could become something else, I could sort of adopt a very sort of esoteric Eastern religion? Who knows?
In theory, yes, I could go anyway. In I'm not so. I don't perceive myself as in this kind of exceptionalist way where I think, I'm totally immune from the culture that I've grown up in. Statistically, if I was going to be religious, I would almost certainly become a Christian, as pretty much anyone raised in the UK, if they're going to be religious, they're probably going to be a Christian. I think that, if I was going to make a prediction, that would be it. In theory, I'm not opposed to some kind of esoteric theism. I mean, Philip Goff now believes in a limited powered God or something like that. So it's in theory, I'm not ruling that kind of stuff out a priori. It's just.
And would you be satisfied in a sense with a halfway house of a sort of, well, I've come across an argument that convinces me that God exists, but I just don't believe he's been manifested in Jesus.
Yes.
But you'd sort of, would that do anything for you? Just sort of a kind of intellectual God that set it all off, but stepped back?
I'd find it like, I think that'd be less emotionally appealing. There's obviously something there, for me, there's something very lovely about the idea of a God that didn't just set things off, but is actively involved in our lives. I think that, of course, the trouble with that is that obviously that's a much higher bar to jump over as well.
And it raises a whole new set of questions.
Exactly. Like I often think that one of the really interesting things I found in the reading, I went back and recently read a lot of the kind of literature around new atheism, including some of the responses like Frank Turek and Ed Feser and that kind of thing. And exactly. So something that I found very interesting is that a lot of the time it was almost seen like deism was almost theism. Right. And I don't think deism is almost theism. I think deism is almost atheism in a lot of ways. I think accepting that there might be some kind of will at the beginning of the universe, but I don't know what it is sort of a hair's breadth from atheism. Whereas
it's interesting to hear you say that, because I've even heard Richard Dawkins say, look, I can cope with the idea that there might be some sort of activating force, or but I think but as soon as you bring in Jesus Christ and God having an interest in what you do in the bedroom, that's where he says, that God I cannot believe in. That's that. But even Dawkins has sort of said, I mean, principle, it'd be possible to convince me of a kind of deistic, kind of non-interfering kind of God who just sets things off. But I mean, we should probably start to pull this conversation towards a close. It's been so fun, kind of talking about where you're at and where you've been. And
well, so if I could say just one more thing, because I do think that like the significance of theism, I think, is like kind of important to note in conversations like this as we get more towards. I think the way that the kind of zeitgeist in kind of public philosophy of religion, let's say, is going, is more towards this kind of God as meaning, or God as value, or God as like the divine structure of the universe, or something like that, and God as sort of merely that. I think that that's all well and good, and maybe I'm just saying this as an atheist that hopes to be convinced, but like I think that theism is a lot more substantial than that. As I worry that sometimes, you know, this way of that particular way of approaching the philosophy of religion, I think it's becoming more and more popular, is fine. I think it's a really interesting discussion, certainly one worth having. I think that it is important nonetheless to hold on to whether you're a Christian or an atheist, to hold on to the take Christianity for example, to hold on to this idea of no, like a claim is that Christ rose from the dead and will come again in glory to judge the quick and the dead. You know, that's like a really substantial idea that if you believe in, seems like it would change every aspect of your, like, overnight. You know, if I believed that, my life would look, you know, would totally transform. It's you know, there's this bit in the Brothers Karamazov where Alyosha, it's kind of in the introductory section, they're introducing the characters, and Alyosha is seen as this guy who's like, well, you know, he was convinced of Christianity, so naturally he became a monk, thinking that you can't carry this sort of thing halfway, and you need to jump right into it. And I do think, you know,
you'd be a bit like that.
Well, I think it's not necessarily, well, maybe I would and maybe I wouldn't, but I do think that rationally it seems like, not necessarily saying that every Christian needs to become a monk or a nun or something, but at least that kind of idea that, you know, this ought to have a really profound impact. And I worry that the kind of almost like presuppositional apologetics of, oh yeah, but you know, you already have meaning, or you already have value, you already have morality and that kind of stuff, that is God. It's kind of like, well, I don't know, if I'm going from an atheist to a theist, that seems like it's going to be a big shift. And certainly if I'm going to go from an atheist to a particular form of theism, like Christianity or Islam, that seems like it should be the kind of thing that fundamentally changes my behavior and my actions, and the whole way that I orient my approach to life.
Well, on that, you, me, and probably the Apostle Paul are all in complete agreement. Yes. You know, it's just we're standing on different sides of the... Yes,
yeah, but I think that, you know, it's important to get that question at least partly distinct from the sort of the general idea of, like, you know, we all, from the general idea of having value or having meaning or having morality.
Absolutely. You know, we can have a conversation about that. Those things can point to God. But for me, you know, I completely agree with you, Joe. For me, at the center of my faith is not some abstract idea that you know, value leads to God in some, you know, purely symbolic way. It's that there's God became flesh, that he entered space, time, lived as one of us, died, rose again, and that fact changes everything. So yeah, we're on the same page, even if we're you know, at different points in that story.
Maybe it's just me putting my bit in for the relevance of classical apologetics.
Absolutely.
And the debates around whether Jesus actually did rise from the dead, and whether the universe does need a fine-tuning explanation.
I think there's a lot of space for that, and it's been really fun talking to you. And so glad in the sense that you're so open and willing to kind of keep the door open to the possibility of that religious experience. Who knows? I mean, I assume you still go to church occasionally.
I dep at the local oratory, actually, where I live. So I'm occasionally surrounded by monks, and it's all very fun.
It sounds like there's still a possibility that ongoing experiment could yield something in the future. Who knows? But
fingers crossed.
Well, thank you so much for the conversation. It's been really fun. And if people want to check out your channel, where should they look for you?
Oh yes, the channel's called Unsolicited Advice, which is, you know, just to say that I know that nobody asked for it.
Well, I appreciate all of that you've shared with me in this conversation. Thanks.
Oh, no, thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching. For more Thinking Faith, do subscribe to my newsletter. And if you want to support my work, you'll get early access episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters even get free signed copies of both my books too, and the chance for a regular catch-up with me. Again, the links are with the show info. See you next time.